So hi everyone, I am Eyes5 and today I'm going to teach you how to design your own plush, or at least the fundamentals of how to manipulate fabrics and patterns in order to create 3D shapes out of 2D materials like fabric. Last time I did a stream here in which I taught people how to make a Metroid, and I very briefly went over myself. I think it might help this time to go into that in a little bit more depth, so you can see where my techniques comes from and what I went through in order to gain the skills that I have. So yeah, we're gonna spend a few minutes just talking about me. So when I was maybe around 9 years old, I made my first plushie, and that was made in a classroom using a pattern. And for the many years afterwards in which I didn't make a plushie, I still retained like two fundamental concepts that go into plushie making, which is plushies are basically bags that you make from the inside out, and then you turn outside in, or the correct way, and you stuff it through a small hole, and then you sew up that hole. And that was, I think, what was most important about plushies. That's the base. That's the end of it. And in fact, in costuming, or in other terminology, there's a term called bagging out, which means just turning something inside out. I don't hear it very often, but we use it in clothes making sometimes, and we call it that because it's basically a bag that you turn inside out. During high school, I didn't really do any work with fabrics, except for the one mandatory home economics course, because I wasn't really into clothes. And anytime you work with fabrics, immediately the first thing people think of is clothes. I wasn't into the idea of trying to make something and getting it mass produced and then throwing it out into the public, and people maybe like it, maybe not. It wasn't until maybe 2005 that I was walking around at a convention, and I saw someone wearing a hat that was basically just like a very simple hat, kind of like this Metroid hat here, but it was like a cat hat. And I looked at it and I'm like, oh, I can do that, and I can just put some nuclei onto it and make a Metroid. So the Metroid pattern is basically 6 panels that form a round shape. And I'm like, yeah, this is pretty simple, and I just put some nuclei on and I make a Metroid. And then later I thought, hey, wait a minute, if I make basically the hat, basically the rest of the Metroid, but I just kind of put a bottom on it and I stuff it, I get a Metroid plushie. Oh. And then I think, what if I take that basic dome shape with the bottom and I kind of put another half dome shape, and then I put some other unimportant embellishments on, and then I get a Mr. Saturn. So for many years, I kind of just experimented with putting shapes together, simple shapes, and doing commissions from that. And the nice thing about doing commissions is that people will request things of you that are outside your comfort zone. So I did that for a few years, learning through trial and error and experimentation. And around this time, Fangamer was starting up, and they asked me to make some products for them. So these are the first 2 products I made for Fangamer. So sometimes you can find these floating around eBay for a lot of money. The Tenda plushie over here, I made a 50 run of, so there's only 50 of them out there. And the News, I made 75 of them. The Tendas were interesting because I made them by hand. So I remember going to school by bus and just sewing them, standing up on the bus by hand. And the new plushies, by that time, I was better at using machines. And that was a run of 75 plushies. And that takes like anywhere between 5 months and 7 months. And they would sell out in about a day and a half. So that was pretty cool. It kind of instilled in me the idea that, oh, I can make things that people will want to buy. But still, like, making each and every single one of them kind of sucked. But Fangamer did help me out on my next pursuit, which was to go into costuming class. Now, I said before that I wasn't really into fashion, but I was really into costumes, because that's very different from fashion in that what you're doing is you're creating a character. You're not creating something that looks pretty. Sometimes costumes are really ugly, sometimes they're very simple. Sometimes you have to make several of them, but it's never like a huge amount like you would in mass manufacturing. So I want to talk a little bit about my costuming experience. So I went to a costuming school for 2 years for film and theater, and and later I ended up working on films such as 50 Shades of Grey, The Good Doctor, Power Rangers, Kim Possible, The 100, several Hallmark films, a lot more films that you probably never heard of. So this one on the side here, this jacket, I didn't make it, but I bloodied it up, and it played on Riverdale, that Archie thing on Netflix. And these bunch of ninjas are from Kim Possible. And I brought this up because it kind of illustrates how weird costumes can get. Like, these masks that these ladies are wearing are completely made out of rubber, and they're all stunt ladies, so they're doing their high kicks and whatever in them. And it's very sweaty and very uncomfortable. And we help them out by putting menstrual pads on the inside, which absorbs their sweat, and they loved it. It worked really well. Another side gig that I did was I made professional pillows. So this really helped me learn how to do things very precisely, because this fabric, some of these beautiful, gorgeous fabrics are $100 a meter, and they're also very difficult to sew. Some of them are made out of velvet, which is notoriously slippery, and some of them have very heavy trims on the side. So let's see, I did all of that. But eventually, Fangamer started asking me for more and more work. And this time, instead of making individual plushies, what they have me do is to do prototypes. So let's go back to our intro screen, and I can show you some of the plushies that I've done for Fangamer. Like, my first one is Hollow Knight, hiding out here in the corner. So I made a Hollow Knight prototype out of an image that they gave me, and then I showed them pictures of it. They said, make these changes. Okay, I go back and make these changes, show them a new prototype, and then they say, okay, more changes, etc., until finally they're happy with it, and the IP holders are happy with it. And I would send them the final plushie, as well as my pattern, photos of the in-progress shots, and also instructions. Let's see, I've also made Grimm for Fangamer. What else? Shantae was Fangamer. The Prince from Katamari is Fangamer. Rousey, of course, Fangamer. And after, eventually I also caught the attention of Symbiote Studios. And with them, I've made several plushies, such as Maple from Rivals of Aether, and also this guy, Sylvanos. And recently released is the Enchantress from Shovel Knight. Alright. Now you know a little bit about me. And you know that a lot of my background comes from costuming and just the traditional ways of making clothes, which can be, of which a lot of the skills can be transferred into making plushies. However, plushies are also very different from clothes, for two main reasons. One, because when you're making clothes, you are always putting it on top of a human body. And human bodies, sure, they have their variations, but they've all got a neck, arms, legs, ribs. They're basically the same. Plushies, however, take on all sorts of different forms and different sizes. So there is no standard way of making plushies, or a standard form that plushies should be. Another thing that plushies do is they're kind of like balloons, in which they will bulge out with the stuffing on the inside, and they will always find the area of the greatest tension and just bulge out from there. While in clothes, it doesn't do that. Like, flesh on bodies is self-contained. It's not going to just bulge out in weird places. Well, in weird, unexpected places, that is. And you can only sort of use clothing to squish in certain parts that are squishable. But anyways, when it comes to clothes, because they're so standardized, you can use almost a mathematical formula to find out how to make a form that will fit them. So this is something that we had to do in costuming class, or any kind of fashion class, is to create a bodice block using only measurements from a person. So if I were to try to make a bodice block for myself, I'd have to take all of these measurements, like my bust. Let me just get my measuring tape. You're going to learn my measurements. Let's see, around, holy cow, 96 centimeters. Nape to waist. What the heck is a nape? Nape to waist is around 40. Waist to hip is around, what is this? 18. Etc., etc. And then you start on a piece of flat paper and follow these instructions. So 1 to 2, armhole depth measurement plus 1.5 centimeters. And you square across. So whatever that measurement is, you add 1.5 centimeters, and you draw the line from 1 to 2. And square across, so then you just draw a random line all the way across. The next step will say, okay, from 2 to 3 should be half bust plus 5 centimeters. So whatever amount that is will be right here. And then you mark this line, center front line. Okay. Oh, square up and down, alright? Squaring it up and down. Hey Bubbly Oasis. Hey Never Been Chris. Hey everybody watching. Hope you're enjoying this so far. But anyways, you'll go through all these instructions, and eventually you'll end up with a bodice block. And bodice blocks will look something like this, but they also might have large differences. Like this neckline might be a little different. This bust line might go all the way down. The angle of this shoulder line might go this direction. The arm scythe might go all the way in here. But either way, eventually you'll make this and you'll cut it all out, you sew it together, you fit it on the body, and you'll go like, wow, I've never worn like a tailored like suit for myself, or a tailored shirt. Because, you know, these days most of us buy things that are off the shelves and made to fit someone that's approximately like us. But anyways, this is the mathematical way of getting a pattern. Now, how does this apply to plushies when plushies are so different? You can use math to get some plushie forms, and then you put those forms together in order to achieve a shape that is more or less like your plushie. And I will start to go into that a little bit later. Instead, I will now go into the second way that you can achieve a pattern. Once again, using clothes as an example. This is called draping, and you can drape on dress forms or mannequins, or on top of the actual person that you want to fit the clothes to. What you basically do is, because once again, people are basically have the same body shape, you can just throw your fabric on top of the form, and then start cutting it, start pinning it, start drawing on it until it looks like what you want it to make. And then you can unpin all of your fabric and then lay it back down onto paper, and then just trace around the fabric, and now you have a nice pattern. And once you have that pattern, then you can apply it to good fabric instead of this gross cotton fabric. Now this is applicable to plushies And some people like to work in this way, in which they'll actually sculpt their plushie before making it. So you see this first example. Let's see. In this first example, this person has made their plushie out of clay, and then they have kind of put pieces of paper on it, drawn onto that piece of paper, cut around it, and then turned it into fabric and sewn it all together. You can also, especially if you're making a fursuit, as you can see here, you can make your inner figure out of foam and then just draw right onto it, put fabric on, make all the adjustments that you need. You can make your inner sculpture out of tape and then just cut out the tape, and then you'll have your fabric or you'll have your final pattern right here. Personally, I don't like to use this form because I make so many plushies that it's really wasteful and time consuming to make a sculpt of it every single time I want to make a new plushie. But however, this method is available to you. Let's see, the third way of making plushies or making a new pattern is by using an existing pattern and manipulating it to your whims and desires. This existing pattern might be something that you achieved through math, through draping, or even if you bought a commercial pattern or used an old pattern and decided to change it up in a way to make your new plushie. Now, okay, this diagram shows very clearly how you might want to change a bodice into a slightly different bodice in which you move the darts around. In each of these pictures, it's the middle image, that's the original bodice, and what they do is they basically shift around the dart. So I'm going to, hold on, I guess it's a little wrong. So what they have done is they've basically taken this slice, oops, shoot, and rotated it on an axis. So you see what I've done here is I've basically moved up this dart in order to create a larger dart over here, which is exactly what ends up happening in the final product. And then it will look like this. And you don't have to use an existing dart in order to move it around. You just need, you can, in the second example, what they did was they made a slit, and they have basically just rotated that slit on the axis and closed up these darts so they don't exist anymore in order to arrive at this new pattern to make it look like this. And the same deal is happening in this last image in which they make their slit over here. Now, I'm going to back up a little bit and explain to you what a dart is, because I was just throwing that terminology around. This is a dart. Oh, not this. This is a dart. A dart is... Wait, let me give you a moment. A dart is often a triangle shape that's cut out of a piece of fabric. And what it does is when you match a dart to its opposite side, you create a hump or a point at the top of the fabric. So if you can imagine a pie shape, and you've cut out a piece, and this is your dart, and then you sew it together, you get something of a cone shape, if it's very exaggerated. So you see, there's a point here. And this is going to be very important, because it is at the apex of a dart in which you get the 3D-ness of a plushie. Sometimes darts are formed not through cutting into a pattern, but through joining two pattern pieces together. And this is something we will see a little bit later, in which we have two pattern pieces, and if we were to join them together, and get rid of where they connect, then suddenly you have two darts. And darts may not always be a triangle shape. They may be a little bit tapered at the end, like they are here. And if that happens, then instead of getting a very sharp point, then you might get a bit more of a rounded point. So if you can imagine, this is a bit of a cone, but with a very soft point. Also, the wider a dart is, so let's say this is your big old dart, the sharper the point it's going to be. So if you have a circle, if you can imagine just taking a sliver out, you're still going to have mostly a circle with a little bit of a point, if this image made any sense. Let's see. Okay, so let's look at some ways you can get a circle or a sphere, because it is going to be, the sphere is kind of a fundamental shape in plushies. It's how you make that nice round shape. And once you know a few examples of what a sphere can be, then you'll know like where you can start to manipulate it. So I'm just going to talk about some of these spheres here, some of these ways that you can potentially achieve a sphere. So the simplest way you can do this is by just making a circle in this first example and sewing around the edge almost entirely, but leaving, well, actually no, entirely, sorry, and just putting some stuffing on the inside. And once you have that stuffing on the inside, you pull your thread and you end up with a bit of a drawstring purse. And sure, it's not a very elegant sphere pattern, but it does have its applications. If you use a very stretchy fabric, then like a lot of these wrinkles at the end aren't going to show. Like I might use it for like an eyeball, like a very googly-eyed kind of eyeball. However, it does have a lot of wrinkles, and that's generally unpleasant. And the reason for that is because the outside of a circle that you made your pattern out of has a lot more material than anywhere on the inside. And all of that material is being gathered towards this one point. And as we go on, we should get rid of that excess little by little. The second example gets rid of some of that excess by just having two pieces of fabric. And what you can do is, with these two pieces of fabric, is if you go along this top path, you can sew almost entirely around the two pieces of fabric. But before you sew it completely, you bag it out or turn it inside out through this little hole. Then you stuff it, and then you sew it. Or, if you go the second path, you can sew entirely around the plushie, around the sphere, and make a slit in the center. And then use that slit to bag out your sphere form, and then you stuff it, and then you sew it shut. I think the most iconic sphere quote unquote, is the happy birthday balloon, like this sucker here. If you imagine those from the side, those are still pretty flat, not very spherical. And all along their sides, they have all these wrinkles because they still have way too much material on the sides. Than there is on like the kind of flat face of the balloon material. Did that make any sense? Basically, I'm saying there's a lot of material over here that generally does not look very good on a sphere. If you use a very stretchy material, though, like maybe you can get away with this, but generally you'll want to go a little bit further if you want to make a round object. I'm going to take a break to drink some water. Okay. I realized I totally forgot something. After I'm done with my lecture, hopefully around halfway through this seminar, I'm going to design a plush from nothing, and I'm taking requests for this plush. So if you guys would think of characters that would make a good plushie and find an image of them, then later I'm going to ask for you guys to post this picture on the chat, and I will choose one to turn into a plushie. There is no there is some criteria for this, but nothing too specific. Just think of something that you want to turn into a plushie, something that you think will make a nice plushie, and potentially something that I will be into. So like like a Nintendo character. I would really enjoy making a plushie of that. So yeah, I'll just be periodically reminding you throughout this seminar, so get ready for that. Anyways, so we'll go on to the next pattern, which is the dome. So now that we've looked at what I have called the pillow pattern, we'll go on to, as I've explained, there's a lot of material on the outside. So what you could do is simply remove it. So you see all these darts here on the dome? You have now removed a lot of the material that is hindering you when making a sphere pattern out of 2 pieces of fabric. And if you were to sew it together, what you would do is you would first sew these side darts in order to make a kind of a dome shape. And when you put these 2 dome shapes together, you make a sphere. So that's hopefully that makes sense. As you can see here with this Mr. Saturn, you can kind of see how his nose is basically a dome. You can see the darts happening here and here. And the more darts that you have, the more spherical it's going to look. In my samples, for simplicity's sake, there's only 4 darts, but usually you want to go at least 6. The pattern for... Okay, heck, I'm running out of space. So the pattern for the Mr. Saturn Nose would... I'm just going to draw it out here, the dome pattern. It looks something like that. And the bottom of that dome would just be a secondary dome. But let's say instead of staying with these 2 shapes, you were to match them together. And then, since they're now touching, you don't really need the seam in the middle where they connect. So you can just get rid of that. And let's say you were to make a cut right here and right here, and separate it from the bulk of the pattern. And let's see, how do I do this? And do that for every single side. So you see how, as I'm doing this, I'm not losing any surface area. It's still going to be the exact same spherical shape that the 2 dome pieces would create, but I've just kind of reshuffled their constituent parts. And this leads us to our next pattern, which I have called the flower pattern. It's basically the dome, but reshuffled. And what you would do is, because you've got these huge honking darts, you'd sew them together first, and once you sew them all together, you get a sphere. Let's say, however, you arrive at this flower point, and then you're like, okay, what if I cut it up this way? So now you have these individual petals. these very ugly individual petals that I could have drawn better. And now we go on to our next pattern, which I've called the beach ball. And I think this pattern is probably the most fundamental one that we will be using, and probably you'll be using if you were to make a lot of plushies, and which I will talk about a lot in the rest of the seminar. We've all seen a beach ball sphere with beach balls, and also with this kind of expanded globe, as you can see here. It's basically these kind of petals, these petal patterns, I will just call them petals from now on. When you put them together, they will form a sphere. And the more petals you have, the skinnier each petal will be, and the more round your shape is going to be. So just keep that in mind. I want to just talk about the last two more as a little bit of an aside, because they're a little bit different. The baseball pattern is very interesting because you can get a very good ball shape, a baseball shape, using just 2 pieces of fabric. And you're just doing nothing but altering their curves in order to achieve a round shape. However, this is a little bit difficult to sew. I'm going to clear this space. Because if you can imagine, this is one part of the baseball pattern, and the other part, if you want to sew it from the inside out first, is going to be looking kind of like this. I should have used a different color. But basically, like, even though this point touches on both of the patterns, this point needs to touch, oh gosh, I should use a different color. This point needs to touch this point. This point needs to touch this point. This point needs to be touching this point. So it will require a lot of finagling, which is actually not the hardest thing in the world, in order to get 2 curved surfaces that are kind of curving in opposite directions to sew into each other. But it's not the most intuitive. Next, I will talk about the cylinder pattern, which is kind of similar to the pillow pattern, in that instead of removing all of the side excess, what you have done is you have made the side flat. So imagine kind of a tuna can. And the thicker that tuna can is, the more it resembles a circle. And I say this with a lot of like hand quotations and sarcasm, because, you know, a tuna can doesn't really look like a circle or a sphere, except unless you use some really stretchy fabric, and then you can kind of get a sphere. I've made this little Chimera plushie here out of basically a cylinder pattern, and I did make some alterations to it, because this piece of fabric right here, like the side circle, actually has a dart that is hidden inside his teeth. And remember what I said before about darts. If you make a dart, then you can make a slight dome shape. So that just gives it the extra bit of a huggability that this plushie has. Alright. So I spoke briefly before. Wait a minute, I'm gonna have a bit of water. I spoke before about how the more parts of a sphere that you have, the rounder it is. Kind of like 3D modeling. The more polygons you have, the rounder the shape it's going to be. So for example, if I was to use a petal shape to make a sphere, and there's 4 of them, then imagine the sphere from the top. It's going to look something like this. It's going to be more cubed than circular, because the distance from up here to down here is much shorter than the distance from over here to over here. This length, the blue line, is each of these lines. The red line is here. So you see how their lengths are different. However, as you start to add more petals to your sphere, the shape gets narrower. So this is times 6. You see, it starts to get more spherical. And if you were to make times 8, my lovely, lovely petal. Wow, I can't numbers today. And I'm running out of space, and this is looking a bit weird. Okay, pretend I drew this competently. Okay, let me consult my notes. Ah, okay. Okay, so you know some ways that you can make plushies, and you know what a sphere might look like, and why you might want to make might want to make a sphere with a lot of elements. Now the question is, you might see me freehand drawing this this wonky shape and going like, okay, this is wonky. Like, how do I make it good? Like, how do I know how fat to make it? How do I know how long am I supposed to make this petal shape? Well, we're getting into math. So I'm going to ask all of you to evoke your high school math in order to create this sewing pattern. What we are going to do is we are going to create a ball that is, let's say, well, I can't, 10 inches in height. Now I ask you, if this sphere is 10 inches in height, what is the distance around it? What is x? Solve for x. I'll wait. I'm going to take a water break. Delicious water. Do 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 do. Okay. All right, all you dunces. Dunces? Well, I failed English. Anyways, x. If you recall, the circumference of a circle is pi r. Wait, what was it? It was 2 pi r. And r is radius. And radius, I can't spell. Radius is 2d. Is half of d. Gosh. D being diameter. Since 10 is a diameter, x is... Okay, am I even explaining this correctly? X equals 2 pi r. X equals... So 2 pi, 2r, that is 2r is d. So 2r is 10. So 10 times pi. So therefore, x is 31.4. There. 31, pi being 3.14. If you recall high school math, which I also do not entirely. This x, I've drawn it in this way, but also you can also think of it like this. Okay, so let's say we want to make, I'm going to draw this bigger over here, your 10-inch tall ball, and you want to make it out of 8 petals. Oh gosh. And, oh geez, I should probably get my grid out. And you're just about, if you're going to make a petal shape, I'll draw another petal shape here. Now that you know X, I ask you, what is the length of each petal shape? Let's call that Y. Thinking, thinking. The answer to that would be half of X, because each of these petals would kind of be half of the sphere. So Y equals X over 2. So Y equals, let's see, 31.4 divided by 2 equals 15.7. So I'm going to pretend each of these little pips over here is 1. So 15.7 means it ends about here. Let's see. The next question is, what is this distance? Look back. Direct your attention back down to the little petal over here. What is the width of this petal? So remember, if every petal added together is X, and you have 8 petals, how many would each petal be? The width of each petal would be, well, let's call this Z. Z would be X over 8, right? Because if you divide this into 8 pieces, then each one would be the fattest part of one of the petals. So let's see, 31.4 divided by 8 equals, so Z equals 3.9. So that means the center of this line, which is roughly here, is roughly this wide. There we go. We got one answer in the chat. Okay, we're getting there. Now here's a fun one. What is the angle at the top of this petal? I should draw it over here. What is this angle? Let's call it A. So if you look at the top of your sphere, what is each of these angles? The answer to that, yes, yes, 45, because the top, like the circumference, not the circumference, the angle of a circle is 360 degrees. So it would be 360 divided by 8, so equals 45. So I'm going to put a protractor frickin' onto my, I could put a protractor like right onto my monitor to figure this out, but I just know it's something like this. Because like if I go down one grid, like if I go down 2 grids and sideways 1 grid, and I do that for both sides, that will make a 45-degree angle. Let's see if I drew this correctly. It's hard to draw. And from about here to here would also be 45 degrees. All right, and then now that I have this this kind of outline, I can draw in my petal, and it should be exactly the shape I need to make a 10-inch high circle. It's not entirely perfect because, once again, this outer edge is different than this inner length, and also the fabric is going to stretch, so it's going to do wonky things, so you always want to test first. For just the sake of understanding this a little bit better, what would happen if we were to make the angle less, or in this case more, than 45 degrees? Now this angle is a little bit fatter, so it would be like, I don't know, 60 degrees or something. What will happen is you will make your sphere, and then it will start puckering in. Kind of like that. And you know what? Maybe that's what you want. If you can imagine, this is now a pumpkin. Well, what would happen if you were to make the angle a little bit too small? So now maybe this is like 30 degrees. What will happen is you will make your sphere, but where all the pieces meet, it's going to come to a bit of a point. And maybe this is also something you want. Like that. Okay, so from this tedious mathematical formula, we have arrived finally at a pattern. And it's a pattern that you didn't drape and you didn't steal, but it's a pattern that you found from just your brain. But however, when you make a plushie, you're not going to stick with this, you know, like not all plushies have this particular shape, they aren't spheres, their seams are not exactly like this. So you're going to want to manipulate it. You're going to want to change the seams around. Like I've shown you a little bit earlier, how you can change a seam, how you can manipulate it in order to change the final product. You can do this while still maintaining the same amount of surface area and the same amount of volume that the plushie contains. So it's interesting that you have to think about it in these terms sometimes, like volume, surface area, perimeter. And I'm going to start talking about why you might want to do that, why you want to go through this kind of trouble. Okay, I'm going to take a water break. And I'm going to take this time to just remind folks that later on I'm going to be taking Plushie requests. So look up pictures of characters that you might want to have a plushie design for. It doesn't need to fit any kind of criteria, it just needs to be a charming plushie, and potentially one that I will find interesting to make. And we will go through it together, and we will... So when I ask for it, when I ask for the picture, then just post it on the chat. Okay, so why should we manipulate a pattern? To account for nap. What does that mean? Okay, let me get rid of this grid. So I explained last time what nap is in a plushie or in fabric. What nap is basically some fabrics have a certain fuzz to them, and they will run in one main direction. And sometimes you want to control that. So look at this Mr. Saturn Nose over here. As I just explained before, his pattern is kind of a dome shape. So I'm just going to draw a rough dome here, using more than 4 darts this time. I think this guy has like 6 or 8 darts. And because he's made out of one piece of fabric, all the nap, or all the fur, is going to go in one direction. So the fur on his nose, you can barely see it here, it's going to go something like this. And kind of, let's see, yeah, kind of like that. However, on this Metroid, I wouldn't want that. I wouldn't want the fuzz on its body to go this direction and on the back go upwards. That's no good. So what I will actually do is I will use the petal form. So if you can imagine, where the petals are all meeting is kind of the top of the Metroid. Each pattern piece will have a nap that's going downwards. Right? So now the Metroid's fur is going downwards, just naturally like a real Metroid's fur would be. Yes. So another reason you might want to manipulate a seam is to provide a seam in which to insert something. So this Ultimate Chimera has a very prominent seam going along his entire side, all the way down to the back of the leg. And as you can see, this seam allows for a place to bulge out some ears, a place to insert his wings, and a place to make the back of his leg. And if you want to think about it this way, the seam will continue. I should use a different color. The seam will continue upwards along this leg, along his belly, down the other leg, up the other leg, over here. And kind of in a similar way, the butt has a seam going along here in order for the tail to stick out of. The seam isn't up here, it isn't down here, it's exactly where I want it to be. When I made the pattern, maybe I created the whole thing and went like, ooh, this seam is too low, his tail's too low. I would have had to move it to the top, a little bit higher. Let's see. Yeah, plushies with an open, let's see. Space Coyote is saying, I love plushies with an open mouth and teeth, but seems complicated to make. Yes, it is very complicated. To make something that has, it's actually easier to make something with a large mouth than it is with a small mouth. Because what happens with a small mouth is, let's see, how do I say this? You sometimes, I actually don't talk about it in this seminar, but I often think about the tension in fabric. If you're making, let's say, a Muppet mouth, if you can envision this, like, shoot, I don't know my Muppet characters. But if you can imagine that this is a Muppet mouth. And Muppets are a little bit different from plushies because they have like foam and cardboard on the inside. So there's gonna be pieces of cardboard that stabilize this inside mouth. However, in plushies there isn't that. This area along the inside of the mouth, there's absolutely nothing to hold it together, to tell it what to do. So what happens in a very shallow mouth in a plushie is that the mouth becomes herniated, if you will. It will, like, that inside of the mouth is going to want to bulge out. However, if you have a very long mouth, like this Chimera here, this area in the middle is still going to want to bulge out, but because it's so close to the edges of the mouth, and those edges are kind of holding things together, it's not going to bulge out in a very noticeable way. So yeah, mouths. They're difficult. Hello, people just coming in. I'm teaching plushies. Let's see. Ooh, this one's fun. So another reason to manipulate a pattern is to make it easier to insert small structures that are difficult to sew. So if you ever have like a really small plushie and you're wondering how the heck did they put that arm into that body, that's because the arms are usually tubes, right? And a tube is basically just a single piece of fabric that's been rolled up. And like you just kind of roll it up and it becomes a tube. Yep. Kind of like that. And so long as you don't sew that tube together, you have a nice large working space. So what happens, for example, let's talk about my crocomire here, is there's a slit here, which is a seam. And with that slit and all this empty space that I've allowed for the armhole, I can just open it right up. And I can insert the arm piece, which at this point has not been sewn together, and is basically a flat tube, as it's shown up here. And then once I sew them all together, I will be able to sew along the tube and down the seam in one go. And I don't have to worry about trying to get my machine into this small little space. In fact, this seam kind of does double duty, and actually most of my seams kind of pull their weight in two different ways, because it forms a very small dart, if you can see. Like this is a sewing line here. It will kind of make an apex right where the arm is, and even though the arm hides the apex of this dart, all the fabric around it is going to kind of slant away. So that gives the crocomire shoulder or body part a little bit more plush, a little bit more roundness and 3D-ness. And the same thing happens with this opening for the leg. And the same thing happens when you put these two pieces of fabric together, this one and this one. So it is this piece of fabric here, and there's a seam kind of running all the way along this fabric here. So what I would do is, when I'm sewing this, is I would actually sew, let's choose a different color, just this top part first, just this little bit, and then I would insert the eyelid piece, which is kind of a round piece of fabric that has a slit in it. I would insert that, and then sew it up, insert another one, sew it up, insert another one, sew it up, insert another one, sew it up, before I bother to sew this side and this side together, which would be this seam. And then I do the same thing I did for the previous legs, in which I now insert that leg in here before sewing up the last little bit. So all of that was planned out in advance in order for me to make this plushie. Next, to change the angle of a structure, I might manipulate something to do that. It's hard to see, it's a little bit hard to see here, but there's a very slight dart right here, and a slight dart right here. And you might notice it kind of doesn't match the leg seams. The leg seam is right here and right here. The reason is because this dart makes sure that the middle of this pattern piece bulges out the most. The leg, however, I have, this is hard to explain. I have done this, okay. First, take note at how the angle of the leg is. I used to have a previous new pattern in which his legs kind of pointed exactly forward. But that didn't look good. It wasn't in keeping with his character. If you know what a new is, he's a character from Chrono Trigger. All their legs are kind of like bow-legged. Bow-legged? Bow-legged. So I took special care to make him bow-legged. And the way that I did that is I actually manipulated the dart on the back of the new. It's a little bit different than the ones on the front. The ones on the front, as I said before, have been centered. The ones on the back are actually a little bit closer to the center, or to the center of the plushie rather than the center of this pattern piece. And when I do that, the entire leg shifts outwards a little bit. And I went to all that trouble in order to achieve that effect. Okay, I hope that made sense. Another reason I might manipulate a pattern is to remove seams and to reduce bulk. So these two are actually the same character. Who can guess what character this is? As seen from the bottom. However, one of them has a slightly updated pattern. And the difference between them is this guy is missing this seam. You can see it very clearly on this one. Yes, everyone got it right. It's Gimmick. The bottom of this plushie is similar to the 8-petaled sphere that we talked about before. So the bottom is 8 pieces. Let's see, how do I draw this? It's 8. So there's a piece here and a piece here. And it has a hole for the leg. And I'm like, okay, there's a very small amount of fabric right here. And I want to get rid of it. So all I did was I made a slit, kind of like this. And then I moved the dart, just like how I showed darts moving on that bodice a little while ago. So, kind of like this. Okay, I didn't draw it very well. But the important part is to make the tips touch. There's a little bit of finagling to get this perfect, because this shape would remain as it is, and you saw that there was like this little bit in the middle where it overlapped. That represents fabric that has been lost. So I would just compensate for that by adding it over here. So the interesting thing about this is now this angle is 90 degrees. This angle is 90 degrees. Because originally when we had an 8-piece petal to make a sphere, each of these was 45, right? But because I've eliminated this dart, it is now 90 degrees. So by eliminating this dart, I have, like, there isn't so many pieces meeting at a point. When they're meeting at a point, you kind of run into the issue of having a lot of bulk. It's just kind of heavy and difficult to sew through. Also, every time you make a stitch, you potentially make things a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller than they're supposed to be. So, for example, every time I sew 2 pieces together, maybe there's like 1 millimeter of material that I've sewn too much of. And it might not seem a lot, but when you multiply it 8 times, suddenly my pattern, the plushie that I end up with, is 8 millimeters too small. So that's why I want to remove that. Let's see. I realized I forgot to mention something earlier on. So if we can just put your thoughts on hold and go back to this image. let's see. I wanted to mention something. I wanted to mention how you can have your 8 or however many number of petal shapes, and you can start putting them together so that you make less than 8 individual pieces. For example, if you put 2 petal shapes together like this, and get rid of the middle, then you have you now have 4 pieces, but they still have the same amount of surface area that the 8 pieces had. You don't have to connect them like at the tip. You could potentially connect them just on the side. Like that. That will also make the exact sphere shape that you've calculated out. But there's now a seam at the top and a seam at the bottom, and they are a single piece, or there are now 4 pieces instead of 8. So maybe that will be advantageous to whatever you're trying to design. All right, let's go back to this. Let's see. Oh, the music stopped. Thanks for letting me know. I will just turn that back on. Yeah, I have it turned way down on my headset, so I don't get distracted with it. What was I doing? Okay. So I've talked to you before about how an apex of a dart forms a hump. It forms like the 3D, just the 3D shape. The hump. Let's just call it the hump. And a very good example of this is when I tried to make a Samus plushie. I made this first version, and it's like, oh no, her butt does not have enough juice in it. I gotta inject more juice. So this one only has a little seam along the side here. This one has a seam here, and here, and here, and here, and here. And each of these darts forms a bit of a peak that together just make this this one big juicy butt, and gives her a bit of a butt crack as well. And not only with the butt, you can kind of see it in her waist as well. How there is this seam that pinches in her waist, and in doing so makes this part and this part of her body extrude, just hump out a bit more. Wow, terminology. But yeah, sometimes if I'm really looking for a very specific shape, like I want something to be like slightly bulged on one side and slightly bulged on another side, I will have to play with the darts a lot in order to get the shape that I want. So here's a very specialized one. I might want to manipulate a pattern in order to provide space to do embroidery. So this is a different type of Metroid than I taught last time, but the body of it is pretty similar in that it is 6 pieces that are basically petal-shaped, put together. It's actually a little bit more than just 6 pieces of fabric. It's actually has a dart at the bottom as well to control its shaping even more. So all of these back pieces, there's 4 back pieces here, have this kind of shape. However, the front piece does not have that. Because I never want to have a seam go through embroidery, either to sew through embroidery or to have the embroidery go right through a seam, because you're just asking for things to be misaligned. You're just asking for like too much bulk, and then the fabric is not going to behave like fabric anymore. It's going to behave like cardboard. Water. So what I've done is for these front 2 pieces, I have simply joined 2 of the other pieces. And in joining them, I can get rid of all this material in the middle. And now I can safely do my embroidery. Yeah! Okay. And the final reason that you might want to manipulate some seams is in order to, is just to make something pretty. And pretty means simply changing the color of a fabric. So if you can see Shantae's face here, her face is mostly flat, and I have just put seams in order for her to have this nice tiara. And then her hair. On Quirrell, who is kind of a bug-like creature, he has seams kind of going all along his belly and along his back. You can kind of see them here. Yes, Space Coyote, there's a lot of your designs in here. Anyways, thanks, I lost my train of thought. So yes, these seams not only help the construction of this particular shape, he's got a very interesting kind of dad bod shape, but they also form the lines that kind of bring to mind his insect shell. So that was a very deliberate choice of me to do that. The same thing is going on with Grimm's cape here. This is Grimm, and he has a cape, and his cape has a bunch of lines on it that actually not only help the look of his character, because in the game his character's cape has a lot of lines on it, but it also helps the construction. If you can imagine, actually, shoot, how do I say this? Well, I'll just show it. So the middle of his cape, the middle piece, might look something like this. But the side piece, the piece that's most on the side, might look something like this. And it's kind of weird thinking, oh, well, what is this going to do? It's so angular. But once you put them all together, it makes this nice collar shape that just goes around his neck quite beautifully. And so I was able to not only have this, achieve this effect, not only because I wanted the look, but also because I wanted the shape. And it's also a little bit, I also do that a little bit on Shantae. Because if you can imagine her face, I'm just going to draw right on here. If I were to leave her face completely flat like this, it would end up looking a little bit flat. So of course I don't want that. I would make little darts. Oh shoot, did I draw it? Shoot, I drew right on the thing. Okay, anyways. I would make little darts. And then I would use the tiara to just encompass that seam. So that when you look at it, you won't even be aware that there's any shaping happening at all, because this part will be connected to the face. And the shaping is just kind of built in to these separate pieces that I put in for aesthetic purposes. I hope that all made sense. I have to go back on this. Yeah, sure. Okay, so now we're going to look at a few case studies in which I have manipulated my... Okay, I need some water. I need a slight break. I'm going to take this moment to remind you guys, especially all of these new folks that have come up, is once I'm done my long lecture, I'm going to take some Plushie requests. So if you have a character in mind, then look up an image of them, and later when I ask you, post that image in the chat, and I will select one to make a plushie out of, or to design a plushie out of right here on set. Ideally, it's one that would make a good plush. It doesn't have to be too easy, or it doesn't have to be too difficult. But it will help if you choose one that appeals to me personally. So a Nintendo character would often fit that bill, because I want to make stuff that I want to make, because that's where inspiration comes from. Yeah, sometimes when I'm making commissions, I'm asked to make something that I really don't want to make. I'm like, oh, I hate this character, I don't want to make it, and then they get pushed to the back burner because I just, you know how it is. When you don't want to do something, you just kind of don't do it. So, what the heck was I talking about? Okay, we're gonna change... Let's see, come on. We're gonna change the view. I'm gonna show you, let's see, this ball. Now, at a glance, it's a nice ball. It does have a hole cut out of it from the bottom, and that's because I made this ball in order to provide a base for a plushie that I was making, and it's going to be the head of a specific character. Now, the back of this sphere is pretty basic. It's similar to the 8-petaled sphere pattern that I showed you before, with the exception of the tops being connected. So it looks like there's only 4 pieces. But as you can see, there's a dart here that makes them connect together. So I'm just gonna draw what the back of that looks like. The back of this plushie. Alright. Looks like this. Right? But the front of it is very different. Look at that. We haven't seen a sphere pattern quite like this before. It's got a dart down the middle. It's got these big patches along the side. It's got the seam at the center front that stops, and these little seams along the side as well. Where's I going with this? But as you can see, it's basically has the same surface area and volume as the back. So I'm just going to show you how I achieve that and kind of demystify how this works. Shoot, how am I going to do this? Okay, the camera's going to be shaky. Because I want to leave this here for everyone to look at. What? Hopefully it doesn't fall off. Stay. Good.